All right. Everybody ready? Can you hear me? Anybody here except Misha who can't hear me, please raise your hand. You can't hear me. All right, let's go. Let me ask that, as we did last week, that you find a way to be in what they refer to in the jargon as a dyad or a triad, otherwise 2 or 3 people together. And the only rule I find in this is if you marry to one person, you get a third person in the group. So I figured out a way to do that. So we're going to have 2 little sessions of discussion on topics, and I very much like for you to be a part of it. So if you would find a way to hook up with somebody in the group, okay? I'll see if I do anything. Thank you. I feel like I'm back teaching it all again. I realized yesterday that 60 years ago, this past August, I was ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church. And over those 60 years, anytime I've been engaged in any way in church life, I've always got spring forward on my agenda. So here we go. I reckon it's unbroken. Let me tell you what we're going to do today. Can you figure out how you're going to squirrel together? Okay. What we're going to do today is I'm going to quickly, for several of you who were not here last week, and even one who said, "If you tell me what went on," and I offered to drop by the house, and she said, "No, don't do that." But I'm going to go over what we did last week very, very quickly. And then the main topic of our discussion today is one which I think is focal to William James' understanding of religious experience, and that is the phenomenon of conversion. So that'll be most of what we do today. We'll give you 3 or 4 readings from people. I wish I could get you to read all these quotations, because in this particular case, what he does is he sandwiches very thin layers of theory or interpretation between long passages from somebody's life. And for me, at least, first time I read it, it was just fascinating. I just found it was a great thing to do. Can't do all those today, but I've got 4 or 5 on the list that I'll try to read to you very quickly. I know reading to people is not a nice thing to do, but at least we don't have up on the screen, so I insult your intelligence by reading to you something you already read yourself. Now, last week, what we did was kind of get insight into the whole process of the creation of what was, and still is, a classic, a bestseller, still in print in about 6 or 7 different versions. By the way, I ordered the wrong one in the book, so that's why I'm working off my iPad. But William James, as you know, was kind of a public philosopher in the turn of the latter quarter of the 19th and into the first decade of the 20th century. He began his pilgrimage by wanting to be an artist, but that didn't last long. So then he moved into medicine, and the only degree he ever earned was an MD from Harvard, which at that time didn't seem too hard to come by. It kind of dropped by and would figure out how to get a degree. But then, through his international connections and through connections across this country, he became fascinated with psychology, which was a brand new discipline. And he got into that, and from that, then, he made the pilgrimage into philosophy. So he was a polymath in the best sense of the word. Physiology, then psychology, then philosophy. Professor at Harvard is a kind of a home base, but a lot of back and forth between Europe, a lot of contact with other people who were doing this really novice enterprise of psychology. So he was hooked into these people, and eventually he became the first American to give the so-called Gifford Lectures. Talked about that a little bit last week. But the Gifford Lectures were established by Lord Gifford. They were established in the four classic universities in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Glasgow, St Andrews, and Aberdeen. And they all have these lectures that have been going on since the late 19th century. Some of them don't do it every year, but they've got, the list includes about 200 plus of dignitaries and intellectual dignitaries in the world, not all of them really directly involved in religion per se, but with insights into what Lord Gifford called natural religion or natural theology. And quite simply put, without getting into it too much, that approach to religion is an approach which sets aside any reference to any kind of revelation from on high. That is the natural religion is an attempt to discover who God is and what God does by observing the world around you. So it started out probably being religious philosophy rather than religion, but these people come along and go out to the edge of William James, the fifth lecturer in Edinburgh, and the first American lecture anywhere in these different lectures. William James took off in the direction of psychology and religion. So that's where we've been going. Now, also last week I talked to you very briefly about the historical context. The latter quarter of the 19th century and on into the first decade of the 20th. That quarter embraces the establishment of psychology as a discipline. First psychological lab was Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, who set up a lab in 1870, and thereafter, before the turn of the century, there was something like 45 or 50 of those labs all over the United States in academic settings. William James had his at Harvard, of course, but that was a new discipline for him, and it came in the midst of great change and some chaos in the whole religious spectrum of American life. I think I mentioned to you last week, it doesn't have anything to do with religion per se, but it influences religion in a whole variety of ways. There was a triple revolution going on in the United States following the Civil War. And from very modest beginnings at the time of the Civil War to explosive kind of representation before the turn of the century, we see a revolution in immigration, strong second wave of immigration coming out of Europe, this time particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, not England and France and Germany, places like that. So there was that revolution of immigration. There was also a revolution attendant to that of urbanization. Good many of these people who came to this country wound up settling in the cities. One commentator spoke of it in New York, and these people getting off the boat, and then they become like a marble stuck in the mud. They're there in New York City. So you get that kind of diversity. So that's the second one. And the third one, which is really generated by the Civil War, it really takes off after the Civil War, is industrialization. And industrialization and urbanization and immigration are all locked together in a changing society in this country. Meanwhile, as I mentioned to you last week, we see for the first time, not only with psychology, but with all the things we call the social sciences, we see an emergence of scholarly reputation of all the social sciences, political science, sociology, history, economics. These disciplines come into their own in this period of time. And some of the really founder figures of all of these movements are set in this particular part of the century, just like William James did. So you've got all that happening. Two things I didn't mention to you last week about that setting that I do want to mention to you today is at that time in American religious life, there emerged a kind of a variation on a theme that had been around almost since the beginning, and that was revivalism and evangelism, and what was loosely termed at that time, didn't mean the same thing as it does now, but evangelicalism. There had been revivals in American life since before the American Revolution. They came up essentially just about one extended generation. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield in the First Great Awakening, Charles Finney, and others in the Second Great Awakening, which was right after the turn of the century. And then a third one had begun right after the Civil War, And the major figure there was a fellow named Dwight L. Moody, who was not an ordained minister. He was a YMCA worker, but he had the gift of persuasion, and he set up really, for the first time, an organized, systematic approach to doing revivals. Before this, it was supposed to go into the city and preach to get through and then move to the next. Uh, Moody, with the help of his wife, set up a whole system. Sort of like the Billy Graham Crusade, if you've ever watched that. Where people come in, form communities, set up disciplines, establish a connection with the community, have meetings apart from the big revival session to help people understand where they are in faith. So, first of all, you get this Dwight L. Moody doing this. It makes a lot of emphasis out of song, too. He had a colleague in Cartwheel Crime whose name was Howard Sankey. And if you look, not so much in our hymn book we got in church today, but if you look back in the previous hymn book, you'll see Ivy Sankey all over the book because he wrote hymns that became popular in American life. So that kind of revivalism was moving, and then right about the time that these lectures are being given in the first 2-3 years of the 20th century, comes a man named Billy Sunday. And if ever you want to look up an interesting character, go find Billy Sunday. He was a good field, no get infielder for the Chicago White Stockings. Didn't get caught in the great scandal that took place in the Black Sox scandal, but he wasn't good enough to stay around too long. He was an absolute, thoroughgoing, wall-to-wall alcoholic. He went right from the ball game to the bar, and he stayed there until he was obliterated, and then he'd come back and do the same thing the next day. But he got religion, and the religion that he got was the common touch. When you read it today, it looks quite unusual because what's really going on here is the jargon of the day. Sometimes you really don't understand what he's talking about. It's like listening to teenagers today. You don't know what the vocabulary is. But he was very, very effective, very animated. He used to start on one side of the stage with the devil chasing like he was stealing bass and then sliding on weight. And get up and he was saying. That sort of stuff was going on. So what you have is a new revivalism, a kind of cruder revivalism than it was before, but very effective in American life. And then the other thing that comes along, and this kind of connects with what with Billy Sunday, but one of the elements which is increasingly central in American religious life, despite the diversity of theological opinions, despite the fact that somebody embraced all the new ideas and others embraced none and stick to the fundamentals, that kind of a spectrum, despite all that, driven through the whole thing is the temperance movement, the anti-alcohol movement. One of the things that struck me in reading these essays today was the number of people whose conversion involved, as a kind of a salient part of the whole thing, abstinence from alcohol, which is very interesting to watch. Anyway, that was something I noticed today. Now, last week we also had before us and discussed in small groups James' definition of religion, which is, as you may know, the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. I don't want to look at it again as we go through this whole thing. But there are limitations, as you all pointed out last week. It's individual, the solitary individual. It is not intellectual, or it may be somewhat, but it's not primarily intellectual. It's not theological in any kind of systematic way. It turns out that this is a personalized approach to religion and has to do with one's individual religious experience. Now, next thing I want to make before we move on is that at the end of our time together, we talked about a whole chapter that was dedicated to two sorts of people. James decided we can find two sorts of people in the world around us, and they are the people who are, as he referred to, healthy-minded, and the other side, he said, was morbid-minded. And the two really can't conceive of the religious experience of people on the other side of that barrier. Now, I've got a little problem with that. I don't think this is an on switch, but we'll come back to that later. In any event, the basic premise of his approach to understanding religious experience is a dichotomy. It is always a tension between this and that. It is always a movement from one polarity to the other. And in this instance, he talks about healthy-minded and morbid-minded. Now, eventually I will come back and tell you some more, sometimes synonyms, other times progressions from this basic dialogue between these two approaches of understanding the world and understanding religious life. But this is a basic premise. Kind of the enterprise is based on the fact that you've got a tension involved in the human experience. So that's what we'll do for the first part of what we're doing. Let me move to paragraph 2 now in the outline. This was fairly simple. We won't spend a lot of time with it. But in this instance, what we have is James deciding to help us unpack this duality of human experience a little bit. The quote that I gave you, I think I gave you on the first page, did I? Yeah, I did. At the close of the last lecture, that was the lecture on the two divisions, we saw the contrast between two ways of looking at life, which are characteristic respectively of what we call healthy-minded, who need to be born only once, and sick souls who must be twice born in order to be happy. The result is two different conceptions of the universe of our experience. That's pretty definite kind of a statement. But anyway, he said you've got these two ways of looking at life. And he begins to use this term of healthy souls and sick souls, talk about once born versus twice born. This becomes a kind of idiom for understanding the whole conversion experience. Now, it's clear as you read James's work that he's much more fascinated with the sick souls and the twice born than he is with those who are healthy minded and once born. Doesn't give him a whole lot of time. So he wants to talk about the plight of the divided self, this discordancy of constitution in human beings in which they find themselves at odds within themselves. In places he says that this kind of approach to life in its extreme is psychopathetic, that you have psychosis that is involved with this if it gets to the extreme. And the tendency of most people to try to self-correct is natural. Now, he spent a lot of time talking about Augustine. You all probably, some of you at least, have read Augustine's Confessions, in which he talks about the way in which, let me get a page up here. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have tried to run a machine. I know better than that. Well, the point of Augustine is, and perhaps it will jump out after the page, I don't have much faith in that, but the point of it is that Augustine, who was tortured by some attempt to be better than he was, seeking some sort of coordination within his life, trying to get his divided self back together, and he was looking for truth and purity. And at one point in his life, he's sitting in the garden. There is a book, it turns out to be the New Testament, book lying next to him, and he hears a sing-song voice, and he thinks a kind of child's voice that may be the garden across the hedge there. And it's kind of the words are tole lege, but what it means in Latin is pick it up and read it, pick it up and read it. So he picks it up and he begins to read it, and all of a sudden he is struck with the fact that this is something that he's been looking for a long time, because the scripture that he reads has to do with moving away from purity to impurity. And then thus begins a new world for him. So, just say, I know what I need to do. Oh, I hate this. I'm sorry. It just doesn't show up. I'm sorry. I apologize. Next one will come up for sure. I'm sure it will. But anyway, part of this whole thing is sometimes this change in life, this unification of one's divided life, sometimes it comes very suddenly, and sometimes it comes very gradually. Uh, the gradual, he uses medical terminology, reaches back to his medical career. He speaks of the difference between crisis and lysis in medicine. I don't think they use the term today. No doctors ever told me this, but anyway, crisis, you know what it means. It's a crucial point in life. It's a turning point. It's cataclysmic in some instances. Lysis, on the other hand, is just gradual improvement. It grows and grows with the passage of time. You got a severe illness, but you're going to get better. And this is the way that he understands the two prospects within the conversion experience itself. Now, sometimes he talks about something that's a little bit unusual to us, and that is non-religious conversion, and also the idea that there can be a counter-conversion on the other side of things. Religion, he says, is only one among many ways to pursue personal unity. Other things might include such things as moral scrupulosity. That was the particular critique of most of our Puritan forebears. They have what one commentator spoke of as the scruple shop of sins, that they could go to and pick one out and be driven because they had achieved what they wanted to do. So that's a possibility. Moral scrupulosity. Other things that cause conversion are things that are very normal in human experience and really may or may not have a whole lot to do with religion. Love, for example. Ambition, for example. Revenge, for example. Patriotism, even. And sometimes the person who's doing this rejects religion altogether in order to find a conversion somewhere else. He quotes one story, which I have written down, so I wanted to go through this. He quotes one story of a young man. It's kind of a modern day version of the prodigal son. A loss of wealth leads to avarice in this person's life. The prodigal son who squandered all of his wealth on riotous living. This young man did the same thing. And then he found himself not in the pen with the swine, but he found himself in a coal yard. So he picks up a piece of coal. He goes out and sells it to somebody. He takes that money and buys 2 pieces of coal. This is the way it goes. Makes a lot of money, and his only objective in life is to make money. And he's on the yard that he's making. So he really rejects religion altogether and turns to avarice as his guiding light to unite his soul. Tolstoy also tells a story, a long story, about a young man who was out hunting with his brother. And as he always did, first thing in the morning, he said a blessing. And the brother turns to him and said, "Why do you do that? You don't believe in any of this stuff." And all of a sudden, it dawns on this man, that the brother's challenge to his piety is enough to flip him to irreligion, so that he discovers a kind of counter conversion. And he moves away from anything that might have to do with religion, and he finds other ways of satisfaction, and even frequently disdains what he's been experiencing prior to this. So you have those kind of counter conversions take place, and conversions that have nothing to do directly with religion. Now, I printed out for you, we're going to talk about this in just a minute. I printed out James' definition of conversion. So on the back side of the sheet is first one of the two paragraphs there. To be converted, to be regenerated, to receive grace, to experience religion, to gain assurance, are so many phrases which denote a self hitherto divided, consciously wrong, inferior, and unhappy. It becomes unified and consciously right, superior and happy, in consequence of its firm hold upon religious reality. Now, James adduces an entire chapter almost of these kinds of changes that take place. And if I can find it, and I think it is really good when you. Here I am at last. This is a young man who grew up in Connecticut, right in the midst of the Second Great Awakening. The documentation of it is in 1830. The change must have taken some years before. But this young man, named Stephen Bradley, tells about the way he was converted. And it's kind of a back and forth, back and forth. I go to church and then I go out and drink. And then I go to church again. Finally, one Sabbath, I went to hear the Methodist at the Academy. He spoke of the ushering in of the day of general judgment. And he set forth in such a solemn and terrible manner as I never heard before. The scene of that day appeared to be taking place, and so awakened were all the powers of my mind that, like Felix, that's in the book of Acts, I trembled involuntarily on the bench where I was sitting, though I felt nothing at heart. Next day at evening, I went to hear him again. He took his text from Revelation, and I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God. And he represented the terrors of that day in such a manner that it appeared as if it would melt the heart of stone. When he finished his discourse, an old gentleman turned to me and said, "This is what I call preaching." I thought the same, but my feelings were still unmoved by what he said, and I did not enjoy religion, but I believe he did. So then he goes home, he sleeps a very fitful night, and when he wakes up the next morning, he gets up, gets dressed, goes and eats breakfast, and then he says, after breakfast, I went round to converse with my neighbors on religion, which I could not have been hired to have done before this, and at their request I prayed with them, though I had never prayed before in my life. I now feel as though I had discharged my duty by telling the truth and hope by the blessings of God it may do some good to all who shall read it. He has fulfilled his promise to sending the Holy Spirit down into our hearts, or mine at least, and I now defy all the deists and atheists in the world to shake my faith in Christ. So, instantaneous on-off button, or off-on button, I guess you might say, to a different kind of approach to religion altogether. Now, here's what I want you to do. I've been talking too long. I want you all to get into these little groups of people, and I want you to take the first question at the bottom of the page. The question has to do with, have you experienced conversion or observed conversion in somewhere else? If so, how does it compare and contrast with James' definition? Would you categorize it as volitional or self-surrender? If you don't want to share about yourself, put it in the third person to talk about yourself. So let's go into these diets for about 7 or 8 minutes.
So we should move around.
But anyway, you do it from trying to do it, all of a sudden you can't do it. Solution.
Yeah, you want to say. I always think that's yeah. I'll say morning. Yeah. And I was that gradual. Yeah, exactly. Thank goodness I've always been friends with
Please take about 1 more minute. 1 minute. Please. Okay, everybody. Say the end of that sentence and then stop. What? Is that? Oh, I did.
Okay, folks, we can stop talking. This is quite a group. I know I'm hearing really good stories, but we've got to stop.
Lisa said I didn't take another drink of water. I'm afraid to do that, but we'll just pass on that. I'm sorry my voice is getting a little thin. We'll get back later and start singing hymns in church, I hope. So what did you learn? You want to share something that you heard you never heard before, or something that you said that you'd like everybody to know?
I like. Okay, so I won't throw.
A relay.
Is that on, Linda? You want to check to see that one? Is it?
In our group, nobody had a sort of definitive, we had conversions, but we all allowed that, we also disconverted two back and forth. But I told the story of my son in Charleston, grew up with a kid named Matt Pridgeon, who went to Duke for college, got very involved in drugs. One morning was out by the beach and police came, he freaked out, he dove into the ocean and was in the water for 18 hours and got washed up on shore. And while he was in the water, saw Jesus. And his life was dramatically changed. He went back to Duke, went to Duke Seminary, and he's now produced a documentary that I would really recommend called Sins of Our Fathers. It's about the Sins of Our Fathers. It's about the misuse and abuse of the scripture historically in the South, especially in Charleston, in the service of first slavery and now racism and now ICE and all that. It's a very, very powerful documentary, but I recommend it.
YouTube, where is it? You
You can get it on Amazon Prime. It's quite well produced. It's Just go sit.
Sounds like you got it.
You're on that. Sins of Our Fathers.
Right. Sins of Our Fathers.
And it's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Oh, thank you for that. That's fascinating. 18 hours. Anybody else want to share one? I don't believe we can talk that way, but if you want to share. Did any group find that you didn't know anything about conversion? Okay, good. What? Good.
A question rather than a brilliant observation. But isn't it possible that Peter and Paul's experiences very different? One very involuntary. It just happened. Paul got overwhelmed.
Yeah.
He undoubtedly had thought about a lot of things. But Peter, when did Peter ever have an experience like Paul's?
Yeah.
And is it possible that those two contributing so much to what Christians understand today is an example of what James is saying, and the way we as Christians should expect one another to have different kinds of experiences, some of which we think through, we grow gradually, we baptize our children so that indicating that we believe they will be raised within the faith, gradually growing and understanding in a very rational kind of way. And the Baptist tradition is one that you are not baptized and recognized as a Christian or recognize yourself as a Christian unless you have had one of those dramatic conversion experiences. I just wanted to bounce
That's a
that off
very,
you.
very good point. James has said a lot about Peter, but he does in great detail explore Paul's Damascus Road conversion and the instantaneous and absolutely unexpected, involuntary way that happened. And Peter's is a matter of growth. And I think looking back at the New Testament, where would you say to Peter, hey, you got it? Well, you say it says you're in Philippi. He says you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. But prior to that, he's kind of working his way through and going very gradually. And he's very much attached to the person, but he was not attached to so much to the phenomenal change that was taking place because he was just participating, standing close in the boat with him, sometimes not. But that's a very good point to make. Now, I wanted to, excuse me, I have to get back up here. James talks about the various changes, and some of them he says are going to be temporary and transient. A wonderful illustration he uses here.
My real question in this whole thing comes to, is he talking about religion in general, or is he talking about a Christian being born again?
He's doing both.
Well, they're two different things.
Well,
I mean, if you have something like somebody that was unique, I would say the Buddha was that way, where he said, and suddenly he received a divine revelation. But if he's being born again, that's within the Christian religion, not just religion per se.
For himself, he says that's the common human condition. It can happen in entirely different contexts, but it happens or doesn't happen with everyone. And I suppose he didn't get into great detail, but this idea of once born, that's a very prominent theme in most of the world's religions, as well as twice born. So I think he's generalizing all of his most of his illustrations come from Christianity or Judaism. I'll give you one in a minute. I think it's just fascinating. But anyway, he is trying to say that this is a possibility for anybody who's got a divided soul, whoever they are. But you're right, Louis, the things he illustrates primarily come from Christianity. Now he says that the psychological explanation of how this happens, he can answer for us. I'm not sure he can, but he says he can, but not why it happens to anybody. The way he tries to explain it is that we have what he refers to as habitual center of personal energy. And sometimes something happens that's sudden and radical and unexpected, welling up from the subconscious. These psychologists in these days are just beginning to explore the dimensions of the subconscious. And he said sometimes this happens radically and unexpectedly. I want to give you one more quotation, because I think this is fascinating. He says, the most intriguing instance of conversion that he has ever seen is a conversion that takes place of a man named Alphonse Ratisbonne, who is a non-believing French Jew, who encounters a man who tries to convert him to Christianity. And he writes this letter in which he describes the whole thing to a friend. He had an elder brother who had been converted and was a Catholic priest. He himself was irreligious and nourished an antipathy to the apostate brother and generally to his cloth. When I first spoke to church, the altar director spoke to me as the cloth. But the cloth means the ministry. Finding himself, Alphonse said, in Rome in his 29th year, he fell in with a French gentleman who tried to make him a proselyte, but he succeeded no further after 3 or 4 conversations that get him to hang somewhat jocosely, a religious bell around his neck, and to accept and read a copy of a short prayer to the Virgin. This is his description himself. If at this time anyone had accosted me saying, Alphonse, in a quarter of an hour you shall be adoring Jesus Christ as your God and Savior, you shall lie prostrate with your face upon the ground in a humble church, you shall be smiting your breast at the foot of a priest, you shall pass the carnival in a college of Jesuits to prepare yourself to receive baptism, ready to give your life for the Catholic faith. You shall renounce the world and its pomps and its pleasures, renounce your fortune, your hopes, and Phoebe, your betrothed, the affections of your family, the esteem of your friends, your attachment to the Jewish people. You shall have no other aspiration than to follow Christ and to bear his cross. If I say a prophet had come to me with such prediction, I should have judged that only one person could be more bad than he, whosoever namely might believe in the possibility. So he goes on, he goes into this church with his friend, he wanders off by himself, and this fellow takes him to the church, and he didn't see anything particularly arresting. This is the church of San Andrea della Frate in Rome. He just wandered in, and I can only remember an entirely black dog which went trotting and turning before me as I mused. In an instant, the dog had disappeared, the whole church had vanished. I no longer saw anything or more. Heavens, how can I speak of it? Oh no, human words cannot attain to expressing the inexpressible. Any description, however sublime it might be, could be but a profanation of the unspeakable truth. I was prostrate on the ground, bathed in my tears, with my heart beside me, when Mr. whatever his name was, came and called me back to life. I could not reply to the questions which followed, and finally I took the medal which I had on my breast, and with all the effusion of my soul, I kissed the image of the Virgin, radiant with grace, which it bore. Oh, indeed, it was indeed she. What I had seen before was a vision of the Virgin. End quote. So here's this radical change. This man who has a complete, not temporary, movement into conversion. One other thing about James, before I move on a little bit, is that is he discovers certain identifiable characteristics of the conversion experience. That most of them are things you would assume. Let me just read the list very quickly. The loss of all worry, truth not known before become clear, changes in the world all around to a much brighter place, photism, that is, flashes of light, light stream, unexpected, and ecstasy and happiness. All those things tend to come in conversion experience. Now, one of the things that I kind of picked up on as I was reading this is the variety of ways in which James sets up dualities. Let me just read you the list I wrote down very quickly, and then we'll talk about some of the things that James says about the value of the changes in life. We've already seen that he talked in last week's materials on the healthy minded versus the morbid minded and the sick souls. We're talking just now about voluntary versus unconscious, involuntary conversions, consciously whether you know it's happening or when it just hits you. He uses the term once born, twice born. He uses the term conscious versus voluntary and unconscious as involuntary. He talks about the meaning of, I mentioned earlier, the meaning of the difference between volitional, in which you're engaged in the process, hoping to make it happen, versus surrender when it is happening. I'm wondering, as I read all this, is this his modus operandi in trying to figure out the words of the quotation, the varieties of religious experience? Now, one of the things before we done today, I want you to talk about something else, and that is a kind of a blunt instrument of antique, if you will, approach to what's happening. He said, we can tell you what's happening, we can't tell you why it's happening. But he talks about the fields of consciousness and the things that happen in people's lives. I say it's kind of a blunt explanation because he speaks of psyche as a kind of field of consciousness with hot spots therein. And sometimes, in some people, from our subliminal minds, we have these, what he refers to, they've heard it anyway, automatisms, these things that explode underneath our consciousness, come to the surface, and claim a place in our consciousness. Sometimes it's temporary, other times it's personal. Often, as I mentioned to you before, this kind of a change is frequently associated with the acknowledgement of a particular weakness in a person's life, like the use of alcohol. And what happens is, this strikes you as a profound change for the rest of your life. James says these things often happen in adolescence. That's a question I will talk about later. But it always happens primarily as a matter of emotion rather than a matter of theological reflection. And some people seem impervious to any kind of change that comes from this subconsciousness. It's kind of dryness of spirit in the field of consciousness. So anyway, we've got this kind of background to deal with. Now, what James does at this point is to set us a goal, trying to assess ultimately the value of any of these conversions and what difference the conversions may make in a person's life. I ask you now, we've got about 10 minutes, I ask you now to take those last two quotations and the last question at the bottom of the page. The questions are our opinion of the difference in the value of the unity. The second one is this bold assertion that converted people as a class are indistinguishable from natural people. So take those on in groups and see what you get. Maybe I'll give a voice back.
Can you define the empirical test again?
The empirical test is the way you observable differences. What you see makes a difference overtly. Everybody can get it. That's the method.
That's what she thought. While she was writing the book, she would
One more minute, please. One more minute.
Tell us when you're ready.
Really,
Okay, we've gotta stop. We've gotta close it up. We only have 2 more minutes with John.
Just in general, one word, one sentence response. What do you make of this idea that, I guess, in a sense, it is by their fruits you shall know them, in that first quotation, first question I asked, and also, do you think converted people and quote unquote natural people look any different from each other? Go ahead. No. Which one?
Everybody's the same.
Second.
Everybody's the same. And I think people can be converted without realizing they're converted. I think it's something that just naturally happens to some people.
Okay, any other ideas on this?
Okay, I think we remember the song, they'll know we are Christians by our love.
Yeah,
Yes, and the concept that, and again, Christianity under that lens, but that if you're a Christian, people recognize that by the way you live your life.
good point too. Anybody else?
Okay, anyway, wait a second here, we got.
In my family, it seemed like there were several ministers, Presbyterian ministers in the family, but there was conversation that the folks who were born again kept telling the rest of us that we hadn't made it yet. That was the biggest difference.
That's good, that's a good conversation for the Sunday dinner table, I'm sure.
We had lots of those.
I just want to come back to the comment about recognizing people who love. So many times in my life, people will come up to me and say to me, I think we're kindred souls. And I think we do recognize people who have love, true love in the way they feel in the world. And I think we can distinguish them pretty easily from the sick souls.
That's a good point too. Thank you. Anybody else got time for one more comment?
I was, wondering, I think about some, friends, some people I know, there's some friends I'm not, but I don't know if I'm thinking about some friends I know, I don't know if they've had a conversion experience, but they are also, they're not Christian, they may be even atheistic, but they're some of the nicest, most caring, wonderful people I've ever met. So maybe this gets into James's thing. I know you said the examples are primarily drawn from Christianity, but the idea of a conversion experience may not be Christian, but it could be something else in their life that converted them to this oversimplification, but to be a loving, nice person.
And I think that last quotation I gave you, I think he absolutely believes that, James said. Well, folks, I think we're gonna quit. And by the way, next Sunday, the congregational meeting, some of us in here are not members of this congregation, but we probably have to go anyway. But that meeting is gonna take place at 10:25.
10:35, I think.
10:35,
So we
yeah.
will have, I know you will love this, we'll have an abbreviated session next Sunday. And I think what I'm gonna do is just blitz through this business of saintliness, because I always think we're all saints, and he doesn't. So I'm gonna get through that in a hurry, then we're gonna talk about mysticism, which I think is really worth our time. So thanks again for today.
And John, thank you. We couldn't stop talking, so I know, but that's how engaged we are with this whole session, so thank you, John.